Hi, my name is Ophi YouTube Videos. I am a feminist and a lesbian, and I make conversational commentary videos about both of those things. But today, I would like to talk about Rent. I want to talk about Rent all the time, constantly, like every day, always. And I have ever since I first saw it about a year ago, which I'm aware 2023 is very late in the game to have seen Rent for the first time, but I promise I have more than enough thoughts to make up for that. If you, like me, a year ago have not seen Rent yet, do not despair. If you have seen Rent, but it was only the movie and you hated it, also do not despair, because I have more to say. I might not change your opinion, but I also might. This video will contain spoilers for Rent, but I'm trying to be mindful. There will be a point where there's a time skip and you can jump out and go watch a bootleg, not the movie. We'll get to it, not the movie. If you fall into either of those categories, unfamiliar with Rent or vaguely familiar with Rent, but you don't really like it, it doesn't really work for you, what I want you to do is at least consider my point of view here and consider maybe trying to experience Rent in at least roughly the order that I'm going to outline in this video. But mostly, I am asking you to open your heart to a controversial but true statement that I am going to be spending the rest of however long this video is making. Rent is good, actually. My take, my official channel take, my nuance corner statement about Rent is that Rent is good, actually. Rent is extremely good, and also, you're not wrong for being uncomfortable with some aspects of the musical Rent. I get it, there are criticisms that I do find valid and justified and that we will be spending a little bit of time with here today. But I also do think that some of those criticisms and some other criticisms get telephone gamed, and they get repeated with less and less nuance and context attached to them each time, until they're kind of unrecognizable from anything that actually applies to the actual show. People do this thing with Rent specifically where they pretend that it is a bad and irredeemable show about bad and irredeemable people, which I personally find to be just the absolute least interesting way to engage with the musical Rent. Also, I feel like some people might be finding my channel through this video rather than people who already watch me watching this as a Christmas special, like I'm kind of filming it intending, hi, if you're new, I love Rent, like I said, I'm very new to it. I would love to hear what other people think about Rent, especially people who have like grown up loving it longer than I've been alive. So in terms of the suggested viewing order, I would suggest anybody start with pretty much what my friend Kit lined up for me when he introduced me to Rent a year ago. This is what I'm going to suggest as the proper viewing order, and this was my viewing order as well. I first heard a lot of really bad things about Rent. I heard some very passionate defense of it from somebody who loves it. And then I watched a bootleg, and then I watched the movie. You probably, like me a year ago, have also heard a lot of things about Rent. I checked this characterization with a few people who, again, have been here for longer than me, and they said that they think I was correct, that I think Rent was kind of the so-called cringe musical it was cool to hate before Hamilton came to take that spot, and I also think that Rent, like Hamilton, is a musical with some pretty fundamental issues and flaws, but also a piece of theater that is really good and really goddamn emotionally effective. I want to roll together some of the bad things that you have probably already heard about Rent along with my rebuttals to them. So don't tune out and go for a bootleg yet. I'll tell you when you can tune out and go for a bootleg if you're really going for the full experience here. I still want to talk to you a little bit first. Let's go ahead and pretend that you don't really have any prior association with Rent. I don't know how possible that is, really, but again, if I had watched this about a year ago, I would have been in your shoes. When I watched Rent for the first time, I gave the friend who showed me the bootleg a, rundown of what I already knew about Rent, which was basically that it is set in New York City during the AIDS crisis, that everyone says it is about bad people, and that the main guy wears a striped scarf. I had a lot of second or third hand exposure to Rent, as I think pretty much everybody in the United States does, at least. I mean, they sing Seasons of Love in The Office. Everybody knows at least a little bit of Rent. And all of those things in my initial summary before I watched it are still varying levels of true, though it's not really how I would explain the musical now if I were trying to explain it with my newfound familiarity with it. Rent is a 1996 musical written by Jonathan Larson, and the movie, look me in the eyes for this. I want to make sure that you do not watch this video and then go watch the movie and think, what the fuck is Ophi thinking? She has terrible taste. This is important. The movie exists as supplemental material to a bootleg or a live performance. Okay? Okay, you can go back to drawing. It's fine. The movie does feature much of the original cast, and it is a bit of a treat to get a chance to see them in that role, especially in a way that is better than film cameras and bootlegs at the time could provide. But you need to see at least somebody younger in these roles, if not these exact people younger in this role, I think, to really connect with this musical and what it is trying to do, and I do not think that the movie is a good way to do that. But it's fine, because you're not gonna watch the movie first. Because that's not a good way to experience Rent. You don't even have to watch the movie at all if you don't want to. If you watch the musical and you're like, you know what, this is good, end it there. Call it good. Listen to the soundtrack. You don't have to watch the movie at all. It's fine. Also, importantly, but maybe already obvious, I am talking to people who like musicals here. I don't particularly care what people who don't like musicals and get annoyed by people bursting out into song think of a musical as theatrical and as in love with being theatrical as Rent is. It's fine if you hate it. I'm not going to be able to talk you into liking this musical if you do not like musicals categorically. The movie, I think, kind of tried to play it safe, tried to be something that people who don't like musicals would like, and it did not work. I think the movie would have been a way better musical if it had not been so goddamn embarrassed about having to be a musical. So, Rent came out in 1996, and I will be making a lot of arguments that probably will not work for a lot of people who have already made up their minds about how they feel about Rent. But a lot of my arguments do come down to Rent very much so being a product of its time. And by it being a product of its time, I mean that it is a musical that was in workshops in 1994, but that is set in, like, roughly 1989, other than some, like, little brief anachronisms, like when they reference Newt Gingrich's lesbian sister. The time period, including those little idiosyncrasies, is very crucial to the staging of Rent. Rent cannot be modernized, or at least it should not be, and that is because Rent itself is a modernization. Jonathan Larson wrote Rent as basically a modern AU of an opera called La Boheme. And I like to joke that pretty much anything you think of when you think something in Rent feels a little bit contrived is because it is literally contrived and it is probably coming from La Boheme. La Boheme is pretty much Rent, but with poor bohemian artists in Paris. And when Larson adapted it to New York City in the 80s, he made one other change. He swapped out tuberculosis with acquired immune deficiency syndrome. And it actually is this change that gives me a lot of the grace that I feel for Rent. I understand a lot of the criticisms of Rent. I understand people's complaints about it. And I'll get into some of them, but probably not all of them. I'm sure somebody will have a really good point against Rent that I have missed. But something that comes up for me again and again whenever I try to engage with other people's criticism of this musical is that I maybe am just reading it differently than they do. Because a lot of the biggest complaints that I see about Rent are either frustrations about not feeling like the characters are good enough people, a silly complaint we will get into later in depth, or about feeling as if the wrong characters are centered in the musical, maybe. Resenting the time that we have to spend with Roger and Mimi and Mark so much that we convince ourselves that things playing out in the background are playing out in the background as a failure of the play and not as a narrative feature. So I did want to make sure that I, at least towards the beginning of this video, say, I get it. A lot of people hate Rent. And I do think people hate Rent in part because of how huge it got, how many non-theater people became exposed to this musical that is so unashamed of its own theatrics. But I also think at least some of the people who hate Rent because they would completely and totally disagree with my next statement. My guiding light for how I interpret this play and why I love it. That Angel Dumont Chouinard is the most important character in Rent. I did not say she should be. I did not say if the play was good, she would have had more time on stage. I didn't even say she exists in a play that's not as good as she is. I said she's the most important character. I'm gonna get into why, and there will be spoilers as I get into why, but also Rent has been out for over 20 years, and I just said that a character named Angel is the most important in a play about the AIDS crisis in New York City in the 90s. So if you haven't pieced together the spoiler by now, I'm kind of impressed. So, to be clear, I am not gauging my estimation of Angel as the most important character on screen time or lines in the play, though I think she does kind of get some of the most showstoppers out of anybody, especially if you're looking at just solos. I'm basing my estimation of Angel as the most important on what I understand Rent to be. What I understand Jonathan Larson to have been saying when he wrote this play, that Angel and people like her not only exist and existed, but that they deeply, deeply impacted the lives of the people who knew and loved them, and that they deserve to be mourned. And that they are worth mourning. Rent features 4 characters who are HIV positive, including Angel. Technically, there are more characters in Rent who are HIV positive, like there's an entire chorus that consists of a support group called Life Support, which Angel attends for HIV positive people. But out of our main cast of characters with like names and plot lines, it's 4 of them. The first character who we learn is HIV positive, and the first character in the entire play who we are introduced to other than Mark, who begins the play by saying that it is 9 p.m. on December 24th, and that he is going to start his latest film today. His film is a home movie, at best, I would say. But he's filming. In the movie, he says, he from here on in, I shoot without a script. I am not shooting without a script. I've been working on this script for a long time. But Mark begins the musical and also his movie by filming Roger. And for all of my effusive praise for Rent, I will say right off the bat, the part of the musical I am going to have the hardest time coming up with particularly positive things to say about is gonna be Roger and Mimi. I love this play. I don't hate them, either of them, but I don't have a ton of buy-in to their relationship for reasons we will discuss. I do really like Mimi, and I especially love Mimi when she is portrayed by Renee Elise Goldsberry, but there's pretty much only one moment throughout their entire relationship where I actually feel any real connection to them together as a couple. It's the moment about halfway through La Vie Boheme when Mimi takes an AZT break and Roger, who is much older than her and who has been keeping her at arm's length for reasons that feel like very good reasons to me, softens upon realizing that they are both positive for the virus. It's a really effective softening moment for a guy who comes across as a huge dick for pretty much the entire rest of the play. And just to be clear, even though I just said he comes across as a huge dick, I also think he has a reason to come across as a huge dick. They make a lot of sense, and they also make a lot more sense after his clear, quiet when Mimi takes her AZT. You get the sense that he not only was keeping his distance from Mimi to protect himself, but also to protect her, and that is now kind of complicated because it's not as crucial to protect her from contracting a virus that she has already contracted. We learn in a simple line in the play, and I believe a much more gratuitous flashback in the movie, another reason not to watch the movie, that Roger's girlfriend, April, died by suicide following learning about her HIV diagnosis, and that also is how Roger learned that he had it. Personally, I agree with the classification of Roger as probably straight. I think the implication is that it would have been contracted via drug use. And the context of his relationship with Mimi, for the purposes of our discussion, I'm going to classify as a straight one, though I don't disagree with anybody who has a read on Mimi as bisexual or queer. I think that's totally valid. I want to note that while I'm saying that I don't really like the relationship between Roger and Mimi, that does not mean that I don't like Mimi. I like Mimi quite a lot. I just happen to find her at her most interesting anytime she and Roger are not sharing the stage. But Roger is a musician. He is a former addict in recovery, struggling to write one great song before he dies. Something that he sees as happening very soon as a result, again, of his diagnosis. Mimi is younger and also just much, much less existential than all of that. Mimi is a sex worker and she is in active addiction, which is a source, maybe the primary source, especially once he realizes that they are both HIV positive, in conflict in her relationship with Roger. So Mimi and Roger are our 2 straight people with AIDS in Rent. They are major characters. They get songs dedicated to their relationship and are often classed as the primary relationship in Rent. I clearly disagree with that classification for reasons that will be more clear as we go into how the story progresses. But I also do think, especially in an ensemble cast, which Rent definitely is an ensemble show, There's a big difference between just like a main character, a character with a lot of stage time, and a most important character. So while you could probably argue that Roger and Mimi are both more main characters than Angel is, potentially, I don't think you could successfully argue that they are more important to the plot than the other two HIV-positive characters, Angel Dumont-Chenard and Tom Collins. Personally, I always use she/her pronouns when I am referring to Angel, though that's not as consistent in the play. That's a big part of the handling of Angel's gender that I see some criticisms of. I think a lot of people have walked away with an impression that she's not quite as revered by the play as she should be, and I think I want to make it clear that I feel differently about that criticism when it is coming from trans people than I do when it is just like, well, that representation isn't perfect and therefore it probably was bad. I respect the right of trans people to be offended by any portion of the representation that is offered to them in Angel. But I tend to be kind of soft on this somewhat flawed trans representation, same way that I'm soft on the definitely flawed bisexual representation that Maureen Johnson is. Yeah, I get it. I see the flaws, I understand it, I respect you if those are too much for you to get on board with. But also, maybe sometimes people are a little messy, and especially in Angel's case, maybe sometimes it's not especially clear, especially from the outside, what's going on with somebody's particular gender identity. Angel is clearly still figuring some things out. Another reason I'm gentle with the play not fully committing to her being a trans woman, I think maybe that wasn't the intention. When she introduces herself to Collins, she says her name is Angel, and then she says, at least that's what I'm trying this week. It is how she's referred to for the rest of the play, though. I don't think the gender fluidity itself is meant to be something she's figuring out. There's another line in dialogue where she says that she used to be a brownie and a Boy Scout until some brat got scared. So it seems like she has known something about her gender since she was a child. And, like with Roger, we learn that Angel is HIV positive pretty much immediately upon meeting her. It's one of the first things that she tells Collins about herself when they meet on the street after Collins has been mugged. And then we learn of his diagnosis in his response to her disclosing. Every single one of these characters is dealing with their diagnosis very differently. Roger is isolating himself, not reaching out to his friends, his family, the support group that Angel brings Tom Collins to. But he is at least taking his AZT. Mimi is shown to take AZT for at least a portion of the play, and then I think it is heavily implied that she is off of it at the end when she comes back significantly sicker than she had been during the beginning of the play's runtime. We, however, do not ever see Collins or Angel take AZT, a point that I'm going to circle back to. While we don't see Angel taking medication for her HIV diagnosis, we do know, again right at her introduction, that she is reaching out to a support group. She attends that support group multiple times and brings characters along with her throughout the musical. Tom Collins, nobody calls him Tom in the play, is a professor and anarchist who is fired from MIT for his radical action prior to the beginning of the play. He ends up teaching at NYU at the end of the musical. I adore Collins. I love Collins and Angel's relationship. It's my absolute favorite part of the show. I think that's true of pretty much everyone I've spoken to who loves this show the way I do. And again, with my read of Angel being the most important part of the show, I don't think that it's somehow unintentional that these are the audience favorites. And I've already breezed right past a couple of the points that I do have nuance for. Criticisms that I can respect, but wouldn't necessarily feel a need to voice for myself in conjunction with recommending this play. But one of the most common arguments I've seen against Rent, as I have already mentioned, is that everyone in the musical is just a bad person. And like I've said, I think that is just one of the most boring ways to attempt to criticize a piece of media. First of all, not every character in something needs to be a good person. Second of all, while these characters can be kind of bratty and whiny and entitled, it's really not an Always Sunny in Philadelphia level of the point is they all suck. So, third of all, I feel that there is this undercurrent in presenting the idea that not only are these all bad people, but also that the play is not aware of it, that you yourself have outsmarted the play. You are now smarter than the play, anybody who wrote it and is performing in it, because you have uncovered the secret truth. That all of these are bad people who simply do not deserve your empathy. And I just think that if you think that you have discovered some truth about the characters in Rent that the play is not intimately aware of, you maybe didn't really pay attention to the show? One of the best scenes in Rent, agreed upon, I think, even by people who hate it, is the scene where the entire musical screeches to a halt so that the writer's self-insert character can be yelled at for his white saviorism. But I do want to at least pretend to take my least favorite criticism of Rent seriously. So, you know what? How about we do a little sorting? I would like to attempt to organize these characters by their relative badness with a little bit more nuance than they are all bad people allows us to give them. I have created some different categories here for this section, though I did come up with less than the typical tier ranking format requires. Our red category is actively sucks. This is for characters who actively suck in a way that actively harms other people. And then we have another category, a term we will be spending quite a bit of time discussing today, theater person. That's our middle of the road here. People sorted in theater person may be people who you wouldn't necessarily want to hang out with, spend a bunch of your time with, but they don't actively suck. I'm not saying everybody in theater person is a good person or a person who I would want to spend time with, someone I would loan things to with any expectation of getting them back. But it is a tier for people who aren't, like, actively yelling at the homeless levels of horrible. And then, finally, for our lovely green tier, I have decided on could never be a theater person. I jokingly wrote first that it was a category for people who have never actually done anything wrong in their lives, which probably isn't exactly true, but this is where I am sorting the people who it would really rankle me to have to define as a bad person. This is, of course, the nuance corner. There will be a little bit more organization than just those three categories, but that gives us somewhere to at least begin breaking things down. Let's begin, as the play does, and as we sort of already have, with Mark Cohen. Mark Cohen is widely understood to be Jonathan Larson's self-insert, and while Rent is an ensemble, and while I'm obviously most interested in the rest of the ensemble, I don't think it's a stretch at all to call Mark the narrator. This also makes sense in the fiction of the musical, because Mark is a documentary filmmaker. He and his roommate Roger, who we will get into soon, are both starving artist types, and though Mark is repeatedly offered a job for a sleazy tabloid called Buzzline, and also he gets a bunch of calls from apparently supportive parents, but who he is estranged from, so the argument is often made with him and pretty much with all the others that they must be a bunch of whiny, entitled brats who you don't need to feel any sympathy for. And I get it. If you hate Mark, I feel you are probably anticipating that I am going to sort him into actively sucks, but I don't think that's exactly where he belongs. And that is an easier decision for me to make, having seen the 2019 version that they did on Fox with Jordan Fisher playing Mark. Holy shit, that guy's charming. And yeah, the guy, Mark, not Jordan Fisher, kind of does suck, but what 20-something does not kinda suck? And wouldn't under the circumstances. And it's not as if the play does not grind to a halt to yell at him and tell him that he kinda sucks. Mark is our flawed window into this whole group, a group that Angel later becomes the anchor of. And Mark is also our documentarian. He's also, and I say this with the full acknowledgement that I understand that this exact thing is likely not very charming about Mark to bisexual women who are bothered by the way Maureen is presented. I say this as a joke, but also kind of not. Mark Cohen is kind of extremely the last man a queer woman dates before she realizes she's over men. Which is just one of many reasons why it makes sense to me that he would have dated and been so into his ex-girlfriend Maureen, who we will rank next, and who is absolutely 1000% also a theater person. So yes, next up, theater person Maureen Johnson. Not the YA author, the character originated by Idina Menzel. As already referenced, the bisexual representation presented here is extremely flawed, but also for this section, I am sort of just addressing Maureen as she exists. I am taking her for what she is, if you will. Okay, Maureen cheated on and then dumped Mark prior to the beginning of the show. These are both theater people, though I guess it's on a technicality because Mark was her production manager. As a character and as part of the show, I kind of do adore Maureen. I don't fault people who feel that she exemplifies pretty much any example you could think of bad bisexual representation. She is a serial cheater. That is a very tired trope with bisexual women in particular. She has a whole musical number to the effect of how that is just who she is, and that there will always be women in rubber flirting with her. She's presented as sort of wily and singular and, yeah, slutty. But she's also a genuine, bona fide bisexual character. And yes, as I've said, the optics of having her cheat on her opposite sex partner and then also to cheat again on her same sex partner are suboptimal if Maureen needs to serve as exemplary representation with a capital R. Bisexual people, and women in particular, are very often acted as if they are somehow incapable of monogamy due to some perceived inability to choose. But also, if we take away the need for Maureen to serve as perfect capital R representation, and we say instead, this is a story with a lot of messy gay and bisexual people in it, and this was a fairly efficient way to get across that this is a woman who is into both women and men, it's not a terrible thing from an economy of storytelling perspective. Also, Maureen is just fun as fuck. Her songs are fun or funny. The song about her is an absolute banger. I've decided in the process of working on this video, because I'm cutting it close, that I want to talk about the 2019 version of Rent more next year, but I do reference it a few times in this one. You can tell Vanessa Hudgens also had a blast playing her in that version on Fox. The tired bisexual serial cheater trope isn't the only one that Maureen falls into. She and her girlfriend Joanne are on again, off again, which, especially with fighting, is an often portrayed storyline with sapphic couples, but much the same way as I think using the cheating to ground what kind of character Maureen specifically is and not what bisexual women as a monolith are like, this being the dynamic between these particular women who are dating, and not on a statement as what all relationships between women are like, I think is okay. It doesn't need my permission to have characters who behave in ways I don't find admirable. And also, like, friend group with a couple of women who are constantly breaking up and getting back together is not outside of the realm of possibility. It was bisexual women specifically who I talked to about Rent for the most part, with some exceptions, including the friend who showed it to me in the first place. We are both lesbians. But I have incorporated a great deal of the feedback I've heard from bi women into what we've already discussed and what I'm saying here about how we sort of justify the problematic representation, and also when I say that Maureen, as flawed as she is, means a lot to a lot of people. My joke about how a lot of young women must have had very sudden realizations during Take Me or Leave Me has had a very solid success rate. So Maureen is not in the theater person tier just for cheating on her girlfriend and being bad bisexual representation. She's there because she is absolutely a fucking theater person. Maureen and Mark share a lot of qualities when it comes to their activism, or what they perceive to be activism. The only major difference is that Maureen wants to be in front of the camera while Mark prefers to be behind it. And another reason that I am willing to forgive the cheating for efficiency of storytelling, it tells me a lot about each of them, that they dated, that they're still friends, that she still gets him to go do favors for her, even against her girlfriend's wishes, because he'll do it, and that's what's most important to her, is her performance and not her girlfriend's wishes. Maureen probably could go into actively sucks, but I don't feel like it's fair to rank her as a worse person than Mark, and I don't think Mark actively sucks. Maureen's biggest issues are mostly ones of being annoying and ignorant and a bad partner. She is a performative activist. That is made very clear in the play, though I guess one could argue only Benny explicitly calls it what it is. I just think that the play is very aware of how stupid Maureen's protest performance is. That very much feels like the point to me. And I have already mentioned her, but just to round it out, let's go ahead and put someone else on the board too. Maureen's girlfriend, Joanne. And if you're familiar with the musical, you already know this. I don't even need to say more. Joanne could never be a theater person. Joanne is that lesbian who Maureen left Mark for, a no-nonsense public interest lawyer. Things we know about Joanne. She hires female engineers. She hates mess, but she loves Maureen. And she is substitute stage managing for Maureen's protest on Christmas Eve. Her mother is a judge, Tracy Toms, who is fantastic. Plays the role in the movie and did the role on Broadway. She took it over from Freddie Walker, who originated it. I adore Joanne. Joanne has never done anything wrong ever in her life. My cat was named Joanne before I saw Rent, but I do regularly ask her now if she could ever be a theater person. And we know Joanne is the good kind of lawyer and not some aggro private interest lawyer because of a phone call she has. Tell them we'll sue, but a settlement will do. Sexual harassment and civil rights too, and also because she informs the roommate gang about their squatters' rights. The roommate gang that consists of the girlfriend she just dumps, ex-boyfriend Mark, and Roger. We already talked about Roger a bit, and you may resist my categorization of Roger as a theater person, but I definitely would class him there rather than in actively sucks, and he self-describes as the pretty boy front man. I don't think it's very much of a stretch. I know I already told you Mark is a self-insert, and that's very widely accepted, but so is Roger. That's extremely clear the more I learn about Jonathan Larson. Rent, the entire musical, is the one great song, the one song glory. If you are the playwright's self-insert and you are inside of a musical, and especially a musical as nakedly theatrical as Rent, you are, in fact, a theater person. Roger's a dick. That's part of his characterization. As I've said, he has an excuse to be a dick. I would argue, especially if you put any effort at all into trying to understand the headspace of somebody with a diagnosis that did, at the time, constitute a death sentence, it makes sense. Roger is not warm and fuzzy, even to Mark, who seems to be the closest person to him, including Mimi, who keeps at arm's length for a few songs. I've already mentioned I don't really love the relationship between Roger and Mimi, not only just because I don't have a lot of buy-in, I especially think it doesn't settle well when you watch the movie, and Roger, who is played there by Adam Pascal, who was like Idina Menzel and Anthony Rapp, much younger when they originated these roles. It doesn't really work. You have him against Rosario Dawson, who's also really not doing a whole lot with Mimi, in my opinion, as someone who was introduced to the character with a much better performer, being Renee Elise Goldsberry. She's younger than him, and she's supposed to be younger than him, but, she's supposed to be, 19, and he's supposed to be, kind of late 20s, and it just doesn't really work in the movie. Like I said, movie bad. I think a younger version of Roger is easier to connect with. I liked him a bit more in the 2019 version, but I always just think I'm gonna think that one of these characters is one of the least interesting parts of the show to me. So, Mimi. As I've said, I don't love what Mimi gets to do in the musical, and based on having read a summary of the plot of the original opera, I get that a lot of that is because she, more than nearly any other character in the musical, is built on some contrivances to make her mostly match up to the source and then diverge from that. But she's also a 19-year-old sex worker with HIV in the 1980s, and she's played in the first version of Rent I ever saw by Renee Elise Goldsberry, who is one of the most talented women on the planet, and that really wired something in my brain chemistry. Renee's version of Out Tonight is wild. It is so good. She's a balancing on bars in these heels. It's so cool. She's so cool. But I feel like Mimi should probably go in theater person if we're using the same rules we used to put Roger there. She does perform at the Cat Scratch Club. This one's actually kind of a hard sort for me, but I am going to place her with Roger, probably just because that's where she would want to be placed anyway. She pursues him really hardcore in a way that makes me feel a bit uncomfortable to watch. I haven't really offended anybody yet when I've called Roger and Mimi's relationships the least interesting part of Rent, but I also have only talked privately about Rent mostly and not made a full video yet, so if this really resonates with you, their relationship, you're not wrong. But also if the Roger and Mimi of it all doesn't really work for you, you're very much not alone. Mimi goes in theater person. Most of these people you could make an argument for theater person for, but do you know who doesn't go in theater person? You know who's the reason I even had to make an actively sucks category? Benny. Benny actively sucks. Honestly, all it takes to go in actively sucks is to be a landlord. Case closed, that's it. But Benny goes beyond actively sucking. Benny is where most of your hatred for the characters in Rent should be directed. But there's a complication here about Benny, who used to be the roommate of Mark and Roger, but who now owns the building, has gotten married, and wants to, do a gentrification. The complication is that in every version of Rent I have ever seen, Benny is played by a beautiful man with a beautiful voice and a beautiful smile. I truly think that does contribute to the rise in takes like, Benny is the only actual adult in the group. You wouldn't think that if that man wasn't beautiful. I can tell you that as a lesbian. Benny told Mark and Roger that he would let their rent slide once he owned the building, but then now he's come to collect. Or, he says, they can simply shut down Maureen's protest for him. A protest she is staging at a tent city that Benny would like to use as mixed-use zoning, a studio he promises to Mark and Roger with condos on top that they would rent out, and an on-paper guarantee that this time he wouldn't change their agreement about not having to pay rent to live in his building. He already has called the cops about Maureen's protest, but his investors would prefer that he handle things quietly, so he wants Mark and Roger to try to talk Maureen out of it. And even though they don't agree with this, when he's on the phone with his wife later, he's like venting and he's saying that he's frustrated that they don't adhere to deals. Benny actively sucks. We hate Benny. Benny is all alone and actively sucks, but you know who isn't all alone in her category? Joanne. We've already gotten to both Angel and Collins, and I'm listing them together in Could Never Be a Theater Person, despite Angel very clearly being a drag queen, which is a performer the same way that a pretty boy frontman would be. It's slightly different. That's right. We're not doing the Angel literally killed a dog discourse because I think that's boring. We never even see this dog. The dog is not a character in the play. And Angel is an HIV-positive homeless trans woman who accepted a cash job that wasn't even direct doggy murder. My client is innocent, Your Honor. She was simply playing the drums when a lady in a limousine drove her away. She said, "Darling, be a dear, haven't slept in a year, need your help to make my neighbor's yappy dog disappear. This Evita Akita just won't shut up," etc., etc. First of all, this is one of the things in Rent that I would say is a contrivance. The character Angel is based on was hired to kill a parrot, and accepting Rent as a La Boheme adaptation, we can say she took this job because she had to for the plot to exist, to make sure that the chess pieces were in roughly the right places. But second of all, ignoring that, because it's okay if something being contrived isn't enough to make you feel forgiving of its clumsiness, as mentioned, Angel is a poor trans woman of color who is HIV positive, and she took $1,000 to play her drums until somebody's neighbor's dog jumped out a window. If it wasn't clear enough that that's not a story that we're supposed to take seriously as cold-blooded murder meant to tell us that Angel is a bad person, the play takes pains explicitly later on for Benny, whose wife Allison owned the Akita, Evita, to say he has always hated this dog. So unlike the criticisms of Maureen or even the other criticisms of Angel that I understand and have space for, I don't have any understanding in me for this one. I think it just tells me that you're fundamentally kind of boring if this one line in Today for You makes you hate Angel. We don't even see the dog. The dog doesn't even exist. Even Angel killed a dog. They're all bad is as bad an argument to me as Benny is secretly the hero. Angel doesn't even keep the money that she earned taking that job for herself, because it's shortly after she's finished with that she finds Collins, who she immediately shares her money with. Coming away from this with a read where she is some cold-blooded pet assassin is just not very believable to me. She, like I think everyone in Rent other than Benny is kind of just trying her best. And I'm not separating Collins and Angel. They are both in Could Never Be a Theater Person. Collins and Angel fall immediately in love when, as mentioned, Angel finds Collins shortly after he has been mugged, and Collins is so poor that there is nothing for the attackers to steal other than his coat. Which, actually, we have now sorted our entire main cast into their broad categories. We will have a little more nuance for these people later, but let's talk next about another thing I see a lot about the characters in Rent. Beyond they're all bad people, that gets used as if it immediately means that nobody should be expected to feel any empathy for them. Something I find actually pretty apocryphal to the canon of the musical, and that is, of course, the "these are all rich kids" argument. With this one, I really don't actually understand where the argument comes from. Like, other than that maybe Joanne's parents are implied to be wealthy, and we have no information about Maureen's, but also neither Maureen or Joanne are part of Mark and Roger doing their whole big rent strike number, so okay? It's just very common to me in arguments that I see about Rent where people are saying essentially, oh, well, if their parents are willing to give them guilting phone calls about not hearing back from them, those same parents also must be willing and able to fund their life in New York City as an artist. They must all be lying about being poor or pretending to be poor when they could simply not be poor. Which, like, maybe my experience as an estranged daughter colors this. Maybe being 26 and this being the 7th Christmas I've spent alone has something to do with this. But I feel like if your assumption about a character who is a 20-something is that their parents would be available to pay their rent, you're telling me a little bit more about your own financial safety net than anything that we know about Mark or Rogers. They're poor. They're poor because they need to be. Again, if we are meeting the play where it is as an adaptation of La Boheme, they just need to be poor. Same deal as the dog needs to be killed because the parrot got killed. We could just say they are poor because the characters they are based in La Boheme are also poor. But also just, context clues, my guy. Easy context clues in Rent tell us that they are poor, and much more of us tell us that they are poor than convince us of anything otherwise. Other than Benny, who is not poor, but who, as I said, we can direct all of our hate at anyway. He's not making a secret about his wealth or his desire to accrue more wealth. Mark and Roger, in one of the big opening numbers, literally are burning pages of screenplays and songs and posters to stay warm because the heating got cut in their apartment. They're suddenly on the hook for a year's worth of rent. They don't seem to have stable jobs. They seemed to be under the impression they didn't have to pay rent here, which, yeah, that would be nice, but, somebody agreed to them that that was the case and then suddenly changed it. The fact that Benny is working so hard to try to clear the homeless encampment nearby tells us not that this is an area that has already been gentrified, but that it's an area that's in the process of gentrification. They're not in some big fancy luxury apartment. Borrowing a line directly from a dear friend of mine here, rich kids who are cosplaying as poor kids aren't burning their own things to stay warm because they're cosplaying and they're not actually so poor that they can't pay their bills. To accept the fiction of this play, you can't come at it with a little cinema sings ding just because you think that these characters who are literally burning their own possessions to stay warm are not proven to you to be as poor as you think they should be. I don't think any piece of media actually gets more enjoyable if you decide that you need to disregard nearly every piece of information you are given about the characters just to satisfy your own bias. And here's what I think the bias comes down to a lot of the time. Here's why my middle tier was theater person. My secondary thesis here, other than the part about Angel being the central character of the musical, is that the primary reason for a lot of theater people's hatred of Rent is actually just that it forces them to confront something about themselves. I don't know exactly where this came from. As I mentioned earlier, maybe it's just the overexposure of even things like Seasons of Love. It's one thing to like musicals, but you can't like the musical. That's way more embarrassing than just liking plays. Or maybe it's because the movie sucks so bad that it made people forget how good the play can be when it's actually about 20-somethings. But if I had to boil it down into just one thing that I think really exemplifies what I mean here, I would pick the song La Vie Boheme. Personally, I love La Vie Boheme. I think it is a blast. I love the staging. I love all the tables in the Life Cafe being pushed together to create like a Last Supper scene. It's a fun song, and also it's really cute because the play this is based on is La Boheme, and this is La Vie Boheme. I love La Vie Boheme, which begins with the server in the Life Cafe, who also would go in has never done anything wrong, if we were ranking minor characters too, expressing his distaste at the cast of the play pouring in after their time at Maureen's protest. And my theory is that it just reminds a lot of theater people of their own behavior after a school play when they all went to the Denny's or the IHOP, and that it's a lot easier to point your finger and say, those are all ontologically bad people, than it is to say, oh, I do that. And maybe for a lot of recovering theater people, it's simply easier to just heave a sigh and at least pick one musical to hate than it is to admit that maybe at least some part of you loved Rent at some point. Or maybe you have truly always hated it and even a lesbian's best defense of it makes no difference to you. That's also fine. I have one more piece of criticism that I would like to address before I move back into that point about Angel being the central character in Rent. And it's somewhat tied to things that I mentioned earlier when I was talking about criticisms of these characters being bad people. I find that some people really hate the protest subplot in Rent, and since I've already set up most of that plotline by now, I want to talk about what happens. So, Maureen, Adele Dazeem herself, stages her Christmas Eve protest at the Tent City. And it's awful. Her point is incoherent. It's more art than protest, and I think the idea is that it's not particularly good at being either of those things. Although I do know that this video makes it more than obvious that I am pretty generous to Rent. But Maureen's protest is this weird avant-garde performance art thing about, dystopia and the cyber arts center that is going to be placed here, it sucks. I feel like the play knows that it sucks. I feel like the play would be written very differently if Maureen's protest wasn't kind of supposed to suck. I feel there would be less of a point made of Maureen's self-satisfaction afterwards. My read on this is that the whole joke is that Maureen got this entire tent city mooing as part of her silly protest skit, and then later she fucked off, went to go have her cast dinner at the Life Cafe. Benny called the cops, and the people in the tent city, not including Maureen, who is now just out partying all night, are the ones who stage a riot, and then are the ones who are punished for that riot by the police, not Maureen. This, like many things in Rent, happens off stage. We learn about it from my bestie Joanne in just one little line. And you should see they've padlocked your building and they're rioting on Avenue B. Benny called the cops. They don't know what they're doing. The cops are sweeping the lot, but no one's leaving. They're just sitting there mooing. And I think the "they don't know what they're doing" is not about the cops, right? It's about the rioters and not the police who are sweeping the lot. Though this is coming from Joanne right after she has decided to break up with Maureen while she was back at the site of the riot packing up Maureen's performance equipment, so she might be flustered for other reasons. But like, it feels to me like the rioters don't know what they're doing because everybody's sitting there mooing because of Maureen's dumb protest. But I think it's like when Benny calls it a performance rather than a protest. And like when Maureen later tells Mark, who has gained clout from his footage of the riot being played on the 11 o'clock news, that they should stage and film another one. And she's very excited, and it's all said without any consideration for the consequences of the people who actually faced consequences for the riot. And that isn't even the only condemnation that the play provides of this sort of performative activism bent. As we've already mentioned, the play stops so that Mark can get yelled at. He gets yelled at by a homeless woman when he is doing what, not to defend Mark, but what we would understand in the 2020s as attempting to record police brutality. And the thing is, in the fiction of this play, this woman who yells at him for that is not incorrect, and she's not shown to be incorrect. He's saying, "Smile for Ted Koppel, officer," and then she yells at him and says that her life is not for some bleeding heart cameraman to try to make a buck on. Her anger feels more than justified to me because he literally was saying, "I'm gonna put this on the news." And I think if we are accepting Mark as being the primary self-insert character for Jonathan Larson here, and thinking of Rent as Larson coping with both AIDS and with its increasing proximity to him via his friends, but not his own actual risk of it, because he wasn't particularly at risk of it, seemingly. Mark getting yelled at like this is a moment where the play is extremely aware of the shortcomings that a piece of media made in those circumstances is always going to have. It's also why Mark is shitty enough to try to film the life support meeting. The play knows. It knows. But also, while I think that woman who sings the high notes in Seasons of Love was correct to yell at him, I also think, "Hey artist, got $1, thought not," is, again, evidence that Mark is also broke. I don't think that it's supposed to be us seeing that and being like, oh, he has so much money in his wallet he's not sharing. I could be wrong, and again, Mark certainly is not flawless. Again, my softening largely comes after having seen him portrayed by Jordan Fisher. But I really don't think Mark is like Xander from Buffy levels of this is very clearly the writer's self-insert and also both the writer and the character are fully irredeemable. Like I said, I know this subplot does nothing for a lot of people, and I also agree that it does not perfectly handle everything that it's trying to handle, but it's at least attempting to address some things. And by doing it this way, not by portraying like perfect, amazing activists and nothing but that, by using that as a character trait for a character so that you can use it as a criticism of their performativeness, I don't know, I just don't think that's nothing. It also feels intentional to me that this performative activism is not to do with AIDS, which I know that's another criticism that some people have of the show, that nobody but Collins seems to be involved in any kind of AIDS advocacy, other than Angel and her support group. But I think that's part of it. Maureen fancies herself an activist. She has friends who are diagnosed with HIV, and she's not involved with any of that. Like I said, these aren't terrible people, but they're also not remotely selfless. And they also aren't revolutionaries, nor are they pretending to be. Rent is not pretending to promise a revolution. I know I keep referencing La Vie Boheme to make these points, but like, if you're watching the Being an Us for once instead of a Them musical, and feeling angry that it's comfortable with portraying counterculture to a mass audience and not trying to change the dominant culture, I kind of feel like it's the same thing as waiting for a boat at the airport. You're probably just in the wrong place. If you do want a play that is about serious, somber AIDS activism, you could watch The Normal Heart or Angels in America. Not everything that handles a subject has to handle it in a fully somber or comprehensive way, although I would argue that Rent is pretty somber in its handling of AIDS. Rent didn't need to be comprehensive, and also I've never gotten the vibe that it was trying to be. It's a musical. It was trying to be a musical, and I think it did an above-average job at that. It did actually end up doing something kind of remarkable, I think, in terms of bringing a conversation about AIDS. And yeah, maybe not a full or complete or comprehensive conversation about AIDS, but a conversation about AIDS to the general public, and it's a conversation that is sympathetic and humanizing to the people who are living with HIV. And that, especially in the 90s, that's not nothing. It is a little bit frustrating for me to be asked to pretend like it is. Okay. Remember I said I was going to give you a heads up before we moved into heavy spoiler territories if you somehow don't really know where all of this is going? That's right here. You can go ahead and hop out if you would like and to find the 2008 cast recording or even the 2019 Fox Live version with Jordan Fisher. That's on YouTube. And then you can come back. Or you can watch this and then you'll know how it plays out and how I interpret what plays out. But I want to talk about another plotline here that a lot of people get angry about, which is that Angel dies in the background. She does. I know I said she's the most important character, so maybe you were expecting that I would argue with that, but that is a fact of the play. It's just that, again, maybe as a result of wanting to convince ourselves that we have outsmarted this musical, I often see that presented as if it is a bug and not a feature. Angel becomes very sick in the background of a breakup song between Roger and Mimi and dies. And yes, that is fucking devastating. I would love to see Rent live at some point, but I also weep so audibly every time that I watch a bootleg that I don't think that I would be able to be in the audience. I start sobbing during Without You. Honestly, I start sobbing during the first version of I'll Cover You. And then it does not stop until, like, well into Halloween. But, like, it's devastating because it's on purpose. Angel dies in the background because that is how people die. In the background of each other's lives, in the middle of the story, while you're in a dumb on-again, off-again relationship breakup that happens 3 times. And if the entire play did not grind to a halt to immediately mourn her when she dies, and discuss her as someone worth mourning, I would have very different feelings about her death happening the way that it does. I would have more sympathy towards this argument, but her death happening how it does is very, very clearly a feature of the plot. We feel confronted and angry and bitter about the sudden and dramatic loss of Angel. We want to have gotten more of her. We want to have spent more time with her. We're frustrated that this happened in the background while we were focused on something else. Because that's how we're supposed to feel. That's how the musical wants us to feel. That is the statement that the musical is making. By killing her like this in the background while other stuff is going on. That's how it feels. And then Angel is not forgotten in the play after her death. Not only does she get a funeral, and not only is she shown to be somebody who is mourned and worthy of mourning, even by Mimi, who I wish that we had a little bit more background for saying that they're best friends, but also Mimi has this whole life we don't know very much about because it's happening off stage, so I believe it. But it's not only that she gets mourned. At the end, when Mimi has her fake-out death, it's Angel who she sees who convinces her not to go into the light. She says, I saw Angel and she looked good. If Mimi did for real die at the end instead of it just being a fake-out, I would feel completely differently about the play, about Angel's role in it, about Angel's death. I would understand the argument that the straight people with AIDS are prioritized in this story over the gay people with AIDS if the big emotional death at the end was the straight woman with AIDS, but it isn't. And also, it is just fundamentally true that straight people also had AIDS, so, like, what are we doing here being angry that there are characters who have AIDS who are straight in this play? Straight people still had AIDS. Straight people still do contract AIDS. And I have so much more to say about all of this, like everything I've already talked about and also other stuff that I haven't even gotten to, but I'm cutting this video very close, so I decided as I'm working on this that the Okie Dokie Christmas Eve channel tradition for as many years as I have something to say will be a 9 p.m. video about Rent on December 24th. 2 different videos popped up over the course of the last week that I felt like I needed to address very quickly, so I just didn't have quite as much time to work on this as I wanted to. But the last thing that I want to touch on in this section is something that I mentioned earlier, how we see Roger and Mimi take their AZT, but we never see Angel or Collins take that medication. And I want to mention that because even though it probably objectively is a kind of corny line, one of the lines in Rent that makes me really emotional is in La Vie Boheme B, when they sing to people living with, not dying from disease. Because, as already mentioned, at the time Rent was set, and also kind of at the time that it was initially being staged as well, even though AZT existed enough to be referenced in the play, and that was a huge improvement over what had been very recent, that all was very recent. And living with, not dying from disease is the kind of thing that now feels just true, and I think in the context of the proper history, as you should be trying to place Rent when you listen to it, it hits differently. It hits like something that was only just beginning to be a possibility, or maybe something that wasn't a possibility that's being said in spite of it not really being a possibility. HIV treatment at that time was nothing like the very safe and effective HIV treatment we have now, which is important because, okay, walk with me here. Angel's first big number when she is introduced to Mark and Roger after Collins brings her back to the apartment is Today for You. This is the song that she sings that's like a big campy drag number. It's very fun. It shows her entire ethos. She is kind and generous, and the no day but today mantra is also hers because she is very associated with the life support group. And when we know how her story plays out, it's gutting to hear her say, today for you, tomorrow for me, when we know there is no tomorrow for her. But she knows that, and that is still how she decides to live her life. And then, as if that isn't enough, as if that wouldn't already be a devastating enough little thing to pick up, during one of 2 reprises that we get to really hammer home how much Angel should be mourned in this play, how devastated we should be by this loss of Angel. In Contact, the song that truly does focus on her passing after we saw her get very, very sick in the song before, she flips it. She says it again, today for you, tomorrow for me, but then she flips it, and it's today me, tomorrow you, as she is dying. And she's singing this song to her lover, who we also know is HIV positive. But the thing is that Tom Collins could have gotten on AZT. He might have been supposed to be implied to be on it in the musical, and I just missed it. He could have gotten on AZT, and he could have switched to a much more efficient and with less side effects protease inhibitor probably just a few years after that. And I am pretty sure that this is a musical that was not written with the assumption that Collins was going to outlive his lover by very long. But Rent is this period piece. It is this period piece that is set in a time that we don't have to live in anymore because of the research that has been done by doctors and scientists, because of the work that has been done by activists and advocates. Activists who, yes, were not portrayed in this musical, but who were at least shouted out and celebrated in it. And because of all of that, Rent is now performed in a world where we know that somebody who contracted HIV in the 90s could be on medication and still be alive today. All 4 of these characters surviving, I really don't think would have been realistic for the time that it was written in. Even Mark says at one point in the musical, he's anticipating that this might not just be the year that he loses one of his 4 closest friends who have been diagnosed with HIV, but that he loses all of them. I'm also always struck by the intimacy of him describing Angel that way. He calls her one of his best friends in Seasons of Love, and not all of the songs in Rent have a timestamp, but both the opening song and Seasons of Love do, and those timestamps are about a week away from each other. There's only a week between him meeting Angel and him describing her as one of his best friends. There's an intimacy there that I could ignore, and that I could say is them telling me something instead of showing me, but again, like so many things in this video, I just have to think of that as intentional. Not only do musicals just run on a quicker time lapse and you kind of have to suspend your disbelief with how quickly people get close to each other, but I think it's more than just being told something and not shown it, though. Because I think, despite Mark being far from perfect and not even being consistent on getting Angel's pronouns correct until after her funeral, that this is a statement on the worth and the value of people like Angel. I thought when I started scripting this video that even I had outsmarted Rent. I thought that I was coming at this with some kind of subversive take to say that Angel was the most important character in Rent. But I have not, and I no longer feel a need to try. In La Vie Boheme itself, it says Angel Dumont Chenard takes her place as queen of all she surveys and beacon of hope in the darkest of days. Angel Dumont Chenard is the most important character in Rent. She is the one we are asking, how do you measure a life about? And she is the one who tells us the answer. Measure in love. The love that she showed so clearly to her friends just even the same day that she met them. The love her friends feel for her even after her passing. The love that her friends still could feel for her now, 24 years later, because they could still be alive. And like I said, I think that's good. Actually, I think it's good. Thank you so much for watching. Even if you don't agree with me, even if you still hate Rent, I hope you enjoyed. I did not realize that this was going to be the first video I uploaded after I hit 10,000 subscribers. That is so exciting. I am so grateful and so happy. Thank you very, very much. Amazing holiday present for me. Thank you also to the person in my local Buy Nothing group who came through when I posted In Search of a Terrible Mark scarf. This is amazing. I really feel like this helped with the production value for this one, especially because I cut this a little too close to do too much fancy with my editing. Happy holidays if you celebrate any of them. Happy Tuesday if you do not. And thank you so much to my lovely Patreon subscribers, a few of whose names you can see right here on the screen. They got this just a little bit early today. And they get a couple extra videos from me every month. Patreon's a great way to help support me financially. I also have coffee if you feel like sending me a Christmas present, but just spending a little time with me, hearing me out, and letting me talk about Rent for over an hour is an amazing Christmas present. Thank you. I love you. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.